So we saw that it was important to keep the glomerular filtration rate of how we filter out fluids into the renal corpuscle very constant, because if fluids go too quickly, we are not able to reabsorb all that we need to out of the urine. If it goes too slowly, we may not be able to secrete all the waste products. So to keep that filtration rate constant in spite of changing blood pressures, we've got renal autoregulation, which is the kidney's ability to adjust that pressure going in. We have regulation by sympathetic neural control, and we also have hormonal regulation. So we're going to look mostly at renal autoregulation, the kidney's own ability to adjust its filtration rate to maintain constant urine volume or constant blood volume, and variable urine production based on filtration rate. But those two forms of autoregulation are called the myogenic mechanism and tubuloglomerular feedback. And their results are largely the same, but they work in different ways. We'll first look at the myogenic mechanism, which focuses mostly on the size of the afferent arteriole. What happens is when there is elevated blood pressure, fluids may flow through the renal tubule too quickly to reabsorb things. So those smooth muscle cells in that afferent arteriole that gives rise to the glomerular capillary bed may contract. So if we go back and look at a figure here, we can see the afferent arteriole has smooth muscle lining its walls. That's the arteriole giving rise to these glomerular capillary beds. And if there is a high amount of blood pressure coming in, it can contract and cut off some of that. Tubuloglomerular feedback means that a high filtration rate will, of course, diminish reabsorption. And this involves what we've looked at earlier called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which we said is the part where the nephron loop, the ascending limb, has modified cells called macula densa cells that come into contact with the afferent arteriole. And the part of the afferent arteriole that contacts the macula densa cells is also modified, called juxtaglomerular cells. So what happens is it's still the same thing, tubuloglomerular feedback, as the myogenic mechanism, but here it's actually this nephron loop, once fluids have gotten into the tubule, that is detecting the change. So that filtration rate means that fluids are going through that renal tubule too quickly. So what's going to happen in tubuloglomerular feedback is that those macula densa cells in that ascending limb is going to inhibit the release of nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is a chemical that can be released that is a vasodilator, and what that would do is the same thing in myogenic mechanism. We would have a larger afferent arteriole, so it dilated, and thus greater flow going into the glomerulus, and thus greater amounts of fluid in the renal corpuscle and tubule. So that's what's causing the problem. But those macula densa cells, when they detect that the flow is going too high through the nephron loop, will inhibit nitric oxide, and therefore, the same as the myogenic mechanism, result in the afferent arterioles constricting. So both that myogenic mechanism and tubuloglomerular feedback, the end result is working the same way. But in the myogenic mechanism, it's the afferent arteriole itself that's detecting too high of a flow. Tubuloglomerular feedback is actually the ascending limb of the renal tubule that is doing it. So we can see how the arteriole size is affected here. If we constrict the afferent arteriole here, we'll have a lower glomerular hydrostatic pressure and thus a lower glomerular filtration rate. If we were to constrict the efferent arteriole, we'd have a higher glomerular hydrostatic pressure and therefore a higher glomerular filtration rate. Dilating the afferent arteriole means a higher glomerular hydrostatic pressure and higher glomerular filtration rate, and dilating the efferent arteriole means a lower glomerular hydrostatic pressure and a lower glomerular filtration rate. So autoregulation means we want to keep this rate constant so that we can produce urine as we should. So this is a homeostatic mechanism. If we have increased glomerular filtration rate, those macula densa cells in the ascending limb of the nephron will detect it. They will detect that increase, inhibit the release of nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, which therefore constricts our afferent arteriole. That decreases blood flow going into the glomerular capillaries, which decreases glomerular hydrostatic pressure and therefore decreases glomerular filtration rate, bringing us back into normal homeostatic ranges for glomerular filtration rate. There are also sympathetic neurons entering the renal hilum. Strong sympathetic stimulation is going to also constrict the afferent arteriole and therefore slow down glomerular hydrostatic pressure and glomerular filtration rate. This would also be very strong in exercise or hemorrhage, which would mean we produce less urine in that time and conserve more fluid for other body regions. Hormones like angiotensin II and atrial natriuretic peptide are also going to regulate the amount of fluid. Angiotensin II constricts the afferent and efferent arterioles, and it will decrease glomerular filtration rate. Atrial natriuretic peptide relaxes what we call mesangial cells. So it's going to be the opposite. It is going to increase glomerular filtration rate, but going back to a figure to show mesangial cells, those are little cells that are located in between the afferent and efferent arterioles here. They're not talked about a lot. Or, they're in between these glomerular capillaries here. We'll show it that way. In between the glomerular capillaries here. And so those can also affect the size of the arteriole. So those are where the mesangial cells are located, and they are involved in ANP. Remember, ANP is secreted by your atrial cells when they are stretched more when blood volume is high. So it may mean we need to release some fluids. So it's going to do the opposite of angiotensin II. So we see a summary here of all the things that affect glomerular filtration rate. Angiotensin, renin-angiotensin aldosterone system shown up here, which you should have learned in the blood vessel chapter. We also see that it's promoting vasoconstriction of the afferent and efferent arterioles, systemic blood vessels, promoting reabsorption of sodium and chloride from the proximal tubule. Aldosterone is also being released, which we said causes us to lose fluid or retain fluid, and also stimulating the thirst center. So this is going to bring glomerular filtration rate into normal ranges, making sure we don't lose too much fluid. And here we have a summary of those autoregulatory, hormonal, and neural mechanisms for keeping glomerular filtration rate constant in spite of changing blood pressure.